cold evening in 1997, located at a corner of a busy street in New York City, was the Timeless Hat Emporium. This famous hat shop was known as the heaven for hat lovers. George Anderson, the owner of the shop, was an experienced collector. He saw hats not just as fashion accessories, but as carriers of tradition and stories. His collection included extraordinary and rare hats brought from various corners of the world. One day, a parcel arrived for George. It had been sent from Brazil. As soon as he opened the package, his eyes were drawn to an extraordinarily beautiful hat. Wrapped in black fur and adorned with intricate golden embroidery, the hat looked as if it were a part of some royal heritage. It was so captivating that George decided to place it in the main showcase of the shop. What he didn't know was that this hat was bound to a dark history. In a remote village in Brazil, practitioners of black magic had cursed the hat. They believed that anyone who wore it would be compelled to kill their dearest loved one. After the curse spread, the locals had locked the hat away in a dark museum to prevent it from causing further harm. But George knew none of this. To him, it was simply an incredibly valuable and unique hat. Within days, a customer bought it, and thus began the terrible tragedy. A chain of events that would slowly pull various lives into darkness. What George had failed to understand was that the hat was not just a fashion accessory. It was cursed. It was a symbol of inevitable death's arrival. The first incident. Paul. Paul was an ambitious and successful young businessman. His life was at its peak, with everything under his control. Every day he was overcoming new challenges, pushing himself further ahead. However, his most beloved person was his younger brother Danny. They had grown up together, always by each other's side, and Danny was Paul's biggest source of comfort in life. One day, Paul walked into the Timeless Hat Emporium and impulsively bought the cursed hat. Its beauty seemed to pull him in, as though it had a magical allure. At first, he wasn't particularly fond of wearing it, but one day his eyes fell upon the rare Brazilian hat that had been placed on display. It captivated him, and he felt as if the hat had been made just for him. Without a second thought, he bought it, eager to make it a part of his personality. Initially, when Paul wore the hat, he began feeling an odd sense of confidence. He became even more successful in business, feeling victorious at every meeting and contract. His confidence seemed to grow exponentially, and life felt like a golden opportunity granted by fate. However, after a few days, something strange began to happen. His behavior started to change. He began experiencing unsettling dreams where he feared losing his brother Danny. The nightmares intensified each night, and Paul felt an inexplicable sense of anxiety taking over. One day, an insignificant argument erupted between Paul and Danny. Words escalated, and Paul, in a sudden outburst, pushed Danny, causing him to fall down a flight of stairs. Before Paul could even react, Danny hit the ground with a sickening thud. In that moment, Paul did not realize that in his anger he had unintentionally caused his brother's death. He stood there in confusion and shock, as if struck by the force of an invisible power that had taken control of him. Paul felt the crushing weight of guilt, but was unaware that it was the cursed hat that had begun to exert its dark influence over him. The powerful force behind the hat had turned his life upside down, and he couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that he could never avoid the responsibility for the tragic incident. The second incident. Karen. Karen was a middle-aged schoolteacher whose life was deeply intertwined with that of her elderly mother. Her mother was extremely kind, peaceful, and loving, and she was Karen's only source of solace. The bond between mother and daughter was profound, and they couldn't imagine a moment apart from each other. A few days earlier, Karen had purchased the cursed hat from the Timeless Hat Emporium for a special event. She believed the hat would bring a new light to her personality, granting her a sense of dignity and importance. As soon as she wore it, Karen began to feel an odd transformation. She became stronger, more assertive, and exuded an unusual sense of confidence. There was a growing feeling of power and authority within her. However, after a short while, tension began to grow in her relationship with her mother. Her mother repeatedly warned her not to become too angry or indecisive, but Karen couldn't understand why their interactions were becoming increasingly strained. Unbeknownst to her, the hat was altering her emotions, and she was unaware of the changes taking place. One night, Karen suddenly became abnormal. An unknown tension seemed to rise within her. She couldn't understand what was happening, yet she found herself unable to control it. In that moment, without realizing it, she strangled her mother to death. Her mother, the very person she had done everything for, was gone in an instant. The next day, as Karen came to terms with her actions, her mind went blank. She couldn't fathom how she had done something she never would have dreamed of. Her mind started to perceive the influence of the hat, but it was too late. She had not yet realized that the cursed hat had silently and unknowingly destroyed her life, just as it had with Paul. The third incident. John. John was an honest and responsible police officer, leading a disciplined and strict life. His greatest treasure was his wife, Emily, with whom he shared a deep and loving relationship. In Emily's presence, John felt at peace, able to forget everything else in the world. One day, on his way to work, John bought the cursed hat from the Timeless Hat Emporium. He thought the hat would complement his uniform and enhance his personality, making him appear stronger and more refined. Initially, wearing the hat boosted his confidence and made him more efficient in his work. However, within a few days, his mood began to change. He entered a strange mental state, filled with restlessness and anxiety. At first, Emily didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, but after a while she began to see subtle changes in John's behavior. One day, after returning from work, John started acting cold and distant toward her. His eyes carried an unusual intensity, and his facial expressions seemed unfamiliar. Emily, concerned, asked him, "John, what's happening to you?" But John couldn't give her a clear answer. One night, while wearing the hat, John felt an overwhelming surge of excitement and uncontrollable agitation. Emily tried to calm him down, but John seemed drawn more and more toward the gun he had in his hand. In a moment of extreme tension, without any apparent reason, he suddenly fired the gun. Emily collapsed onto the floor, and the sound of the gunshot left John in complete shock. He stood there, holding the gun, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His mind felt distant, as though lost. After firing, a strange emptiness enveloped him, and he realized his body had been acting independently of his will. He simply stood there, stunned by the outcome of his actions. Emily, the one person he loved and trusted most, lay there lifeless, her trust in him shattered. John began to blame himself, but there was no time to process what had happened. The curse of the hat was slowly stripping away everything in his life, one tragedy at a time. New York City was engulfed in a strange sense of fear. The three separate, isolated incidents, Paul, Karen, and John, had gradually spread grief and terror throughout the city. There was something odd about these deaths, as if an unknown force was controlling them. However, the residents of the city couldn't grasp why or how these events were happening. As the news spread, George Anderson, the owner of the Timeless Hat Emporium, began to think deeply. He soon realized that all these incidents were connected to one cause: the rare Brazilian hat he had brought into the shop. The hat had become more than just an object. It had turned into a cursed, living entity. It had taken control not just of his store, but also of 3 different lives, leading everything towards destruction. Once he made this connection, George believed that if he could destroy the hat, everything would stop. So one night, amidst the city's terror, grief, and sorrow, George made up his mind to destroy the hat. He felt this was the only way. Upon arriving at the shop, he saw the hat lying on the table and grabbed it. He knew that in order to destroy it, he would need to do something powerful, but for reasons he couldn't understand, his hands began to move toward the hat and put it on. There was an unsettling pressure building in his mind. The hat seemed to exert its influence over him, pulling his body toward it. Suddenly, in an instant, the hat seemed to drain all of George's energy. His hands trembled, and his body stiffened as if it was no longer under his control. He struggled to hold himself together, but an unknown force began to rise inside him, a force that was compelling him to act against his will. Out of nowhere, George noticed his son, Daniel, standing in the corner of the room. But the look in Daniel's eyes was terrifying, and this only made George feel more helpless, his confidence shattered. In a moment of panic, George suddenly focused on his son, and the gun in his hand slipped out. Strangely, he couldn't control himself. His body seemed to be under some power. The curse of the hat once again took everything in its grasp, leading George down a path of destruction. He was forced into a situation where he didn't even have the time to comprehend what was happening. In that instant, he was compelled to kill his own son. As his son lay lifeless, George's vision turned dark, and all he could think about was the unimaginable power of the cursed hat. It was so powerful that it could tear apart even his own family. Over time, the streets of New York City began to return to their usual pace. Yet, in a corner of the city, the Timeless Hat Emporium remained closed. Paul, Karen, John, and George, each marked by the dark shadow of that one terrifying hat. After their deaths, their families, friends, and loved ones were left in tatters, shattered by the curse that had consumed their lives. Although the city moved on, the lingering unease and fear persisted in the hearts of its people. One day, after the death of the shop owner, a decision was made to reopen the store. When the new owner entered the shop, he was met with a strange and eerie sight. There, in the showcase, lay the same rare Brazilian hat. It was just as it had been before, chocolate black, adorned with golden patterns, almost as if it were the final mark of everything that had happened. The hat sat there, still and silent, as though waiting, but there was something deeply mysterious about it, as if it was biding its time, ready to find its next victim. The shop's window displayed a new sign, "For sale." The hat that will change your life. It was the same cursed hat, the one that had claimed so many lives, and anyone who was drawn to it would find their life transformed, but in an unknown way, where wearing it meant unknowingly choosing the path of death. Below the sign, a message read, "Call now and change your fate." And so, our story ends. If you enjoyed this tale, we would greatly appreciate your valuable feedback. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay with us. Thank you for your time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again in another video.